everyone, it's Shannon here with Waffle Flower Crafts. I'm so excited to be here with you all at Simon Says, sharing with you how to create this really fun ink smooshed tree card with the new Adventures stamp set from our August release. We're going to start by stamping a sentiment from the Adventures stamp set. This set is really awesome and very fun to play with techniques with. It has some amazing sentiments and this beautiful image illustrated by Camo. She's a Japanese artist and I really love her gestural style, and this is such a great set for making masculine cards, and like I said earlier, for trying out different techniques. We're going to use ink smooshing today to create the leaves, but there are many different types of watercolor techniques, like wet on wet watercolor techniques, even some ink blending techniques that you could use to create the look of leaves for the trees. And with different colors you can make it look like different seasons, and you could even experiment with landscapes with this set, because it basically gives you a focal image and then you can play around with your different background landscape scenes. So a really fun set to play with different watercolor techniques or just different card making techniques. Now that I have my sentiment in the right spot, I'm going to pick it up with my MISTI. If you saw earlier, I had my main image, the image of the tree with the boys, on a piece of acetate, and I kind of held that piece of acetate and moved it around and then had my sentiment underneath and was looking through the acetate to make sure that the sentiment was kind of in between the branches, and that's helped me get my positioning right on that sentiment. I am using my MISTI today because I'm stamping onto watercolor paper, which has some tooth to it or some texture, and this just allows me to stamp it twice to make sure I get a clean, crisp image. And I did ink it up in VersaFine ONYX black ink, which is a waterproof ink. I'm now going to create a mask. If you saw, I just quickly stamped the sentiment again on this post-it note with the residual ink that was still left on the stamp after I stamped it on my watercolor paper. And now I have a pair of scissors and I'm just trimming around the sentiment, leaving a nice little border. Even though when I positioned my sentiment, I did try to get it in between the branches, but some of the branches still were on top of the sentiment, so I want to make sure I mask my sentiment off here. So when I do stamp the tree and the boys, none of the branches will be on the sentiment, making it difficult to read. So I quickly cut that out, and now I'm ready to move on to stamping that focal image. I'm going to use my MISTI again, and I will line up that post-it note with the stamped sentiment underneath. I'll grab a couple pieces of washi tape here to hold it down in place, because I did actually kind of cut off any of that tacky part of the post-it note which would have held it in place. And now I'm going to grab my stamp, position it to the right of the card, but still center it in the panel, at least center it vertically, and then I will pick it up with my MISTI, and then I'm going to ink it up again in VersaFine ONYX black ink, again, which is a waterproof ink, which is important because we are going to be introducing some water to this panel when we do our ink smooshing. And then remove the mask, and now you can see that the sentiment is very easy to read. The branches are not blocking or on top of it, so the mask worked really well. I did stamp my image again on another panel of watercolor paper, and now I'm going to stretch out these images just a little bit. I want this focal image on my main panel here of the tree and the boys to be all the way to the edge of the panel, all the way to the top and the bottom. So I am just sketching out the rest of that branch and the top of that trunk there. Really easy to do. And I used a Sharpie, which is a permanent marker, which again won't bleed. Now I'm going to draw the hand and foot on this image of the boys in the tree. I'm actually going to fussy cut these boys out and place them on top, which is why I didn't draw the hand and foot on the panel with the sentiment, because those boys are going to be covered up with these boys on the second panel. I'll hold these panels up to the camera so you can take a better look at how I extended that tree and added a hand and extended that foot on the boy. You of course could avoid this just by having a smaller panel. Now we're ready for ink smooshing. So I have a small piece of acetate here. You definitely want to use a smaller piece just to have a little bit more control over where you place your ink. We're going to try to avoid placing any of the ink on the trunk itself. It doesn't matter if we get it on the boys, but we do want to avoid the trunk. Remember, the boys will be covered up with that second image that we made earlier where I extended the foot and the hand. So now I just smooshed on the acetate some distress ink. I'm starting with crushed olive, and then I spritzed the ink with some water. I spritzed it till the ink kind of beaded, and so I have a little bit of droplets on the surface. Then I flipped the acetate over, and now I'm smooshing and applying that ink onto the watercolor paper. I'm now cleaning it off and then getting some more because it was getting spreading out a little too much, and I didn't have much ink still left on the acetate. I will also sometimes use the corner here, which you'll see me in just a second, and kind of grab ink and move it around in some of those areas where I have a lot more ink on the watercolor paper, so you can kind of move ink that way. And once I've kind of finished this, I'm going to clean my acetate, get it ready for the next color. But before I move on to my next color, I'm going to heat set or dry that first layer of ink. I'm now moving on to my next color, which is Mowed Lawn. I'm spritzing with some water here. I do have a piece of paper underneath that acetate when I ink it up, and that's just so you guys can see a little bit better where I'm placing the ink and how much ink I'm placing down on that acetate. And I do often, you see here, I often place some ink down, and then I kind of run out of ink, and so I'll get some more of that same color and then spritz it with water and then start applying it onto the paper. So you can see here, by drying our ink in between layers, the ink doesn't mix as much and become one color. The ink kind of keeps its individual color and also its individual shape, so it kind of has more of that droplet shape, which does mimic leaves a little bit better. So we're now moving on to our third color here. This is Evergreen Bough, and I again just smooshed on the acetate, spritzed it with water till it beaded, and then I'm smooshing it down onto my watercolor paper. And with each layer, the tree is getting more depth and just looking better and better. I'm now moving on to my very last color, which is Lucky Clover. This is my darkest color. I basically started with my lightest and worked my way down to my darkest. I used the most of my light color, which was the crushed olive, and I'm using the darker shades more sparingly. That's just so I don't lose any of that beautiful light green from the crushed olive. And now I'm just going back to that crushed olive to add a little bit in between the boys and the tree, just to kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps. Now with my chamois, I'm picking up some of that ink. That's where the sentiment is, just so you can see it a little bit better. So my chamois was just a little bit damp and picked up some of that distress ink, and that will complete the tree. I'll let that dry and we'll move on to watercoloring the trunk. So I have a piece of plastic here with just again white paper underneath so you can see the colors, and I'm going to use distress inks again, but this time I'm going to use them to watercolor. So I just smushed some ink down onto the plastic, and then I sprayed some water to the side there, and then I took my brush, picked up some of that water, mixed it with the ink, and now I'm applying this watered down ink directly onto my watercolor paper, and I'm painting in all the branches and the tree trunk. I will get some of this brown on the boys, but again, we're going to cover those guys up so I don't have to worry about them so much. And I'm sure you guys noticed that I did get some of those green from the ink smooshing onto the smaller branches of the tree, and it does darken the tree a little bit, or it does darken the brown, but it doesn't bother me. I think just with the going over with this brown ink over those branches still makes them pop and separate from the leaves in the background. This is going to be my lighter color. This is brushed corduroy that I started with. Now I'm moving on to walnut stain, and I will get a little bit more brushed corduroy down below just to kind of help blend, but I'm going to take this walnut stain, which is a darker color, and just add a shadow to give the tree the look of some roundness or some volume. And once I place down this darker color, I'll go back to that brushed corduroy and mix it a little bit maybe with the walnut too, just to kind of help blend it out a little bit so it's not just like two colors side by side. It has a little bit more of a gradation blending from the brushed corduroy to the walnut stain. Now that's all done. I'll set that aside, and I'll now move on to watercoloring the boys. I'm going to color these boys in the same manner that I colored the branches and the trunk. I'm going to use Distress ink, smoosh down onto my plastic palette, and then incorporate some water to get the inks a little bit more fluid, and then I'll take that watered down ink and use that to color in the images. I have the inks that I'm using on screen so you can follow along. I'm going to play some music and I'll meet you back when I'm just about done coloring these guys in. So I am back. I'm just about done coloring these guys in. I'm just going to finish their boots here with some ground espresso, and that will complete my watercoloring. I'll hold the panel up so you can get a little bit closer look. I really do like coloring with Distress inks. I really like the translucent quality of the ink. So I let those boys dry, and I'm now going to fussy cut them out. First, I'm just going to cut off the excess of this watercolor paper. That'll just make it a little bit easier to fussy cut these guys out. I'm going to cut right along that black exterior line of the image, so actually even like right on it a little bit, cutting it off a little bit. I want to make sure there's no border left from the paper. I went ahead and cut out most of my fussy cutting of these boys. I do want to point out that I cut between the hand and the boot there to remove that interior section of paper between the boy's arm and his back. Just hold it to the camera so you can get a better look at that. It's actually pretty easy to fussy cut. The only tricky parts are some of the hair, and any of the really thin pieces I just cut right off because the hair is stamped onto the panel, and so you'll see it. I just used some liquid glue to glue my panel down onto an A2 top folding card base made from 120-pound cardstock, and now I'm snipping pieces of foam tape to add to the back of these boys that I fussy cut out. Now, if this fussy cutting looks a little daunting to you, you could also do masking. You could mask the boys off with some masking fluid and then remove it and then watercolor them, but I do like the dimension that I get by fussy cutting these out and then putting them on foam tape. It has a little bit more depth to this card. So I'm holding up to the camera here so you can get a good look at our beautiful ink smooshing that we did to make the leaves on this tree very quick and easy. I also love all the depth that we got by using 4 shades of ink for those leaves, and I love the boys popping up with the foam tape. It really adds another fun layer to this card. I hope you guys enjoyed today's project and video. If you want any more information on the products I use, please visit Simon Says, and thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.